Welcome, subscribers. It's so good to see you all. I'm Stephanie Manning, Vice President of Marketing and Circulation. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for another subscriber exclusive event. It makes me so happy to see you taking advantage of the benefits of your subscription. I'm pleased to tell you that everyone attending tonight's event has been entered into another perks drawing to win a copy of Colin's book, The Republic of Pirates. It's really just a small way for us to say thank you for being here and for being a subscriber. Winners will be notified by email tomorrow morning, so keep an eye out for that. We're grateful for your continued support of our work. It makes the journalism and events like this possible. I have the great pleasure of introducing tonight's host and guest. Katherine Lee's been the web editor at the Portland Press Herald for 3 years. She was the city editor for 5 years before that. And previously, she worked at the Tampa Bay Times and the Tuscaloosa News, where she led the newsroom to a Pulitzer Prize in breaking news back in 2012. She most enjoys traveling and exploring Maine, the place she has called home for the last 8 years. Thanks, Katherine, for being here tonight. Colin Woodard needs no introduction, but he is the New York Times bestselling author and award-winning journalist. He's the author of 6 books, contributing editor to Politico, and his work has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, The Economist, the Smithsonian, and dozens of other publications. We are fortunate to have him as the state and national affairs writer at the Portland Press Herald and Maine Sunday Telegram, where he won a 2012 George Polk Award and was a finalist for a Pulitzer Prize in 2016. Please join me in welcoming Katherine Lee and Colin Woodard to the Zoom stage. Enjoy tonight's conversation.
Thanks, Stephanie. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining our conversation with Colin about his book, The Republic of Pirates, which was written 14 years ago, but is popping up all over again in all kinds of media, from movies to video games to brand new TV series. Thanks also to everyone who submitted a question in advance. I tried to incorporate some of them into my questions, but if you don't hear yours being answered, please feel free to submit it now, and we'll have room at the end for some live questions. So let me start, Colin. Your book before Republic of Pirates was Lobster Coast, which was all about Maine. How did you then pivot to writing a book about the pirates of the Caribbean?
Right. Well, it was a long trajectory, which kind of has me wind up in American Nations later. And it went something like this. I was a history major in college, but I finished high school, Mount Abram High School in Salem Township, Maine in 1987. And that was at the height of perestroika and glasnost and Mikhail Gorbachev and the Soviet Union. And so, in the mid 80s, it seemed like something might change with the Cold War and everything else. So I was studying Russia and Eastern Europe. I was an East European and Balkan history major. I ended up in a study abroad program in 1989 in Budapest, which was excellent timing because communism collapsed while I was there. I was hooked. I stayed on. I know the history up and down in that region, spent most of my 20s and most of the 1990s there. And then I came back to the United States and back to North America in the late 1990s. And one of the lessons of being in Eastern Europe and the Balkans is the depth of power of history, the way that events that happen decades, centuries, even millennia ago, people know their history for better or worse, and it dramatically affects life then. Ideas of belonging and wars over the past were taking place then, right? The communist system had collapsed. A new something was going to happen. The Soviet Empire, when it took over this part of the world, had reinvented history and rewritten it to match, Marxist-Leninist ideology. Now it was being rewritten again, often in inventive and sometimes horrifying ways, based on the nationalisms that have been suppressed in the 1930s, and so on. The power of history in our lives now and how it can shape events was very clear if you were living in that region then and knew the history. Then I found myself in North America, right? We're an amnesiatic continent and Americans don't know their history very well. It's not taught very well. I didn't know it all that well, even though I was history minded. I started living and traveling in different parts of the country outside of New England, Chicago and the Chesapeake country and the US-Mexico border and southernmost Texas and other places, and was just struck at how incredibly different it all was. And so I got really interested in that, in the history, and I had a sense that the differences between the different colonial projects had created a balkanized continent and a balkanized country in the United States. So I needed to know my history. And I was really interested about Maine's backstory. So I came to try to understand our own state and our idiosyncratic culture and why it was that I grew up in a place where, you know, people whose families had been in the town for generations considered themselves to be natives, and the other people were from away. And I was born in Maine, but my parents were from away. And somehow that made you sort of like a provisional immigrant or something. What was that all about? What was the backstory to it? And so that was the moment where I really had to delve into North American history to understand the backstory to our own state. And in the process of researching and trying to decode Maine's history, I learned a lot about the colonial history of the US. And by the time I wrote Lobster Coast, which tells the story of Maine, I was really interested in trying to pull people into the colonial period to understand the country at large. And so the book that became Republic of Pirates, originally the effort was, you know, how could you trick people into eating their broccoli, into learning about the colonial period? You need some compelling, you know, megafauna to bring them in, as the environmentalists say, and, you know, the dinosaurs were too early, but the pirates, hey, they're perfect. Everyone loves pirates, and they're occupying this period in the middle of the colonial period, the Golden Age pirates between like 1714 and 1720. A lot of them are from France or England, but are based in primarily in the Caribbean, but are raiding vessels and involved in, you know, corruption with local officials and everything else, from Newfoundland all the way down to the Spanish Main, and are intercepting, you know, the slave trade, and so they're involved in the transatlantic commerce in Africa. I mean, everything was tied together. It's like, oh, perfect vehicle. You know, I can fool people into understanding this past and bring it alive. So that was my original idea, was to use the pirates to trick Americans into learning the salient factors in colonial history, except the pirate story turned out to be so completely unlike we had heard and been taught. I kind of got hooked into all that and in telling the pirate story. So that's the long story of how I got from the Balkans to Lobster Coast to writing a book about pirates.
Okay, so for me, and I suspect for a lot of people, our familiarity with pirates, at least the 17th century kind, was formed in childhood by the Disneyland ride, still my favorite ride, and then the Pirates movie franchise. And I'm guessing a lot of people still love pirate stories because in the last few years, we've had not only the Disney movies, but the Assassin's Creed Black Flag video game. We have the Netflix series, Pirate Kingdom, and just a couple weeks ago, I read the director Taika Waititi is producing, directing, and starring in a new comedy series about Blackbeard. So why do you think people still romanticize the Golden Age of Piracy?
Well, the thing with the pirates is, which I learned while researching the book, is that the pirates were, you know, how could it be that these people who appear to be awful criminals and terrorists and rogues, why would we consider them to be heroes? Why would we champion them, you know, have all these sympathetic anti-hero characters in, you know, comic books and Disney movies and Robert Louis Stevenson? You know, how is it still holding on to us? And part of the reason is the pirates were anti-heroes and folk heroes at the time they were still active. Because the pirates, these particular pirates, this Golden Age pirate gang that Blackbeard and Sam Bellamy and Calico Jack Rackham, the gentleman pirate Stede Bonnet, the women pirates Mary Read and Anne Bonny, and so forth, this sort of pantheon of great pirates that many people have heard of, were all one gang who all knew each other and operated out of the Bahamas in like a 3 or 4 year period. And they were different from the pirates who came before and the pirates who've come since, in that they didn't consider themselves to be rogues and villains. They consider themselves to be basically fighting a social uprising to settle the score with the ship owners and ship captains who'd made their lives miserable as merchant sailors or in the Royal Navy and so on. You know, merchant sailors in this time period in the early 18th century were being terribly exploited. There'd been a colonial war that had ended, the War of Spanish Secession. And one of the side products of that was the Royal Navy downsizing by 2/3 and essentially dumping tens of thousands of sailors in ports all across the Caribbean with no means to provide for themselves, and also had revoked the sort of maritime mercenary commissions, these privateering commissions that were given out to people to basically attack enemy shipping with the permission of their king, to be legal pirates, as long as you're pirating the enemy. All of those were revoked by all the sovereigns. So you suddenly had tens of thousands of privateers as well. and they all had no work. And if you could get work, the merchant marine realized they didn't have to pay people very much, and they could be highly abusive, and there'd still be, dozens and hundreds of people clamoring for the job. So it was a terrible time to be a sailor. And a number of these people just decided they'd had enough and they were going to rebel. And the funny thing is, the climate was such that their argument that they were Robin Hood's men, that they were settling scores on behalf of the common people, even if they were kind of keeping all the loot themselves, seems to have been believed by an awful lot of ordinary people on both sides of the Atlantic. The various authorities were trying to capture these pirates. Cotton Mather in Massachusetts, Lieutenant Governor Spotswood, the head of the Virginia colony, and the Attorney General of South Carolina all wrote these voluminous letters back to imperial authorities in London, talking about how these pirates were villains and devils and had to be suppressed. And at the same time, in the same letters, they were also talking about how many of the people in their colonies supported the pirates. The governor of Virginia had to keep secret from his own legislature what his plans were to move against the pirates, because they would leak them to their pirate friends and sources. And there was an uprising when they finally caught Stede Bonnet in Charleston. Hundreds and hundreds of people rose up and tried to break him out of jail and so on. And there was this crazy book that came out while some of the pirates were still alive, called The General History of the Pirates, spelled with a Y. It was published in 1724 by somebody using a pseudonym. And it was highly sympathetic to the pirates, kind of describing them as these Robin Hood's men and perhaps lovable anti-heroes. The same ideas and approach that pop culture has now to the pirates was established then by this book. And it was a super hit on both sides of the Atlantic. So, it started then. That book has still been in print. And essentially the pirates grabbed hold of the popular imagination, as people were going to say, enough is enough. I've had it with the way the world works. I'm going to go out on a merry life in a short one and take off with my, I'm leaving the highway. I'm not commuting to work today. I'm driving off into the desert, and survive as a raider, right? That impulse, it was established then and has been with us for the 300 years since. It's been pretty consistent the whole time, which is kind of the amazing part.
So in your book, you paint this as a period of lawlessness, the wild west of the seas, where you could make a fortune if you weren't too ethical and you didn't ask too many questions about where the cargo came from. But at the same time, you could lose it all in a heartbeat. You could drown at sea, you get blown up by a cannonball, you'd be hanged by your own government. But the pirates kind of managed to carve out this sort of a functioning democracy. How did they do it?
Yeah, so one of the reasons that this particular pirate gang is celebrated is because they were very successful. And primarily they were successful because they were able to move in and establish their own pirate republic, a pirate base. Unlike other pirates who were, sailing around in a vessel, and if anything went wrong, they got demasted in a storm or in combat, and they wouldn't have a shipyard to go to. They had nowhere to fence their goods. It was just a matter of time before you were going to be caught, or an accident would befall your crew, and that would be that. But if you have your own country, your own base to operate out of, your own economy, your own docks, your own, smugglers and transshippers who will buy your goods and basically launder them and bring them to the ordinary ports, and then bring you back the stuff you need, the rum and the sailcloth and the tar and everything else. Well, that's a different game, and that's what the pirates did, and they were able to do it because when this colonial war ended, that preceded and essentially was the catalyst for the creation of this pirate outbreak, the War of Spanish Succession. During that war, the British colony in the Bahamas Islands had been destroyed by the French 3 times, burnt to the ground. It was essentially a failed colony. And Nassau, the fort was largely destroyed, and there were, a few hundred English Bahamian settlers trying to survive there, but basically living in hovels in the jungle. And the pirates, after the war, moved in first. They're the ones who reoccupied the place. They're the ones who shored up the fort and moved cannon into the batteries surrounding the harbor, and basically made themselves a pirate nest from which they could not easily be dislodged. And the fact that they moved in before the authorities did and basically took this, abandoned colony, and it was a strategically located colony, right? It's right there, in the Florida Straits, the way the the prevailing winds worked at the time, sailing vessels like, big square rigged ships can't sail directly into the wind. Their sails just flap. They have to sail off the wind. Any sailboat does. They have to tack if you're going into the wind. But square rigged large merchant vessels back then couldn't, they got 50, 60 degrees off the wind. And with windage, they could make almost no progress in most conditions into the wind. So all ships were basically compelled to follow the prevailing wind directions in these wind-driven sea routes. And the only way for the Spanish or anybody else in the whole, western half of the Caribbean could get back to Europe was essentially to sail through the Florida Straits. It was the highway. They were pretty much had to do it. On one side was the Florida Straits was, Florida, which was claimed by Spain, but which actually still controlled by indigenous people who didn't want any trespassers there. So there's no hope on your left side. And on your right flank are the Bahamas, which are controlled by the pirates and this maze of islands and uncharted reefs. The pirates can jump out at, grab the passing, tractor trailer trucks off the highway and drag them off the curb and, dismantle them at their will. And so it was a perfect base. And this allowed the pirates to metastasize rapidly and become a threat to all of the European empires in short order.
So this so-called Golden Age takes place during the rise of global exploration and conquest and the height of the slave trade, which was central to the establishment of colonies in the West Indies and South and North America. Can you talk about the role of slavery in transatlantic trade during this time? And why was the New World in general and the West Indies specifically so ripe for piracy?
I mean, the slave trade, this is at the peak of the slave trade is starting to happen in this time period. The English and French, borrowing from Brazil and Portugal, had perfected in the previous generations the most brutal form of like slave gang, sugar plantation economy. And had deployed that in Barbados and in the throughout the West Indies colonies. And so that was the money machine that was making certain planters in the West Indies, English planters and French planters, phenomenally wealthy. They were the nouveau riche of the age. They might have come there, their grandparents to Barbados a couple generations before, penniless, but they'd won this survival of the fittest struggle with no morality and no rules to become the dominant players of the sugar plantations of this island. Then they'd run out of space. And in the generation preceding the pirates, a lot of these English West Indies slave lords had moved to the new colonies in the subtropical coastline of what became the Carolinas and Georgia and elsewhere, and started moving essentially a West Indies modeled slave society into these new colonies. That's where the Deep South sort of economic and social system, distinct from the Chesapeake country, where you also ended up with slavery, but it started as, manorial lords with Enlightenment pretensions, the Lord Granthams of the world, Jefferson, Madison, all these people who are going to build manor houses modeled on the English West Country, and they supposedly have the social contract with the peasants. And well, we can't get any peasants, so we're going to start following the deep Southern route and bringing in slaves. The distinction with the Deep South is this was just from the beginning, West Indies modeled hardcore horror system and fantastically profitable. So at the time the pirates outbreak begins, their pirate base is surrounded by a lot of these slave colonies that are, the lifeblood of this vast, flow of wealth flowing in the form of sugar and then into rum and working in the triangle trade to enrich, England and other metropolitan people. And the slave trade is massively valuable. So you start, say, in England, and a slave ship would go down to the coast of Africa with trade goods, inexpensive manufactures. You trade them for slaves on the coast of Africa. Then you bring the slaves in the middle passage across the Atlantic to the West Indies, where the pirates were, and sell them in these brutal slave markets throughout the West Indies. And then the ships would work their way northward, maybe through the Florida Straits, full of the gold and treasure and profits that they'd obtained, to work their way back towards the markets to complete the triangle. And so the pirates, knew this, and the slave vessels were enormously valuable to pirates on that third leg. When they departed and they were full of the profits of their voyage in a ship that was large, designed to be very fast because the perishable cargo, right? The people would die if it was slow, and could be well armed. So it had all of the attributes that the pirates might also want. Be able to carry their own cargo, be able to speed the Royal Navy's frigates and the like, and to be heavily armed. So a lot of pirates wanted those vessels and wanted to prey on them. And the interesting thing, and a bit of a mystery with the pirates, or a conundrum, is their own attitude towards the slave trade and towards people of African descent, which is ambiguous. On one level, it's clear that the pirates were willing to recognize the humanity of people of African descent at a time when people in neighboring colonies around them would not have, and make them full-fledged members of the crew, and often officers and often captains on their own right. And many, the governors of these slave plantations write all these letters about how horrified they are that the pirates' base in the Bahamas is encouraging their own slaves to rebel or to wait to rise up. If the pirates come, that the slaves will rise up in rebellion to help the pirates, that many of them are running off to join the pirates. So there's that. And you know, as much as a quarter or a third of pirate crews were people of African descent. And like Blackbeard's, you know, the people closest to him to the very end, his closest and most trusted crewmen, you know, like 3/4 of them were of African descent. So there's that. But at the same time, even Blackbeard, when they captured at one point, Blackbeard, a ship coming in from the Middle Passage, starting to enter the Leeward Islands that hadn't offloaded its human cargo. And when they capture that vessel, which they make into his flagship, he gives many of the people chained down in the hold to the slaver captain and lets him take them off to market. In other words, they weren't necessarily anti-slavery. And the question becomes, why did they treat some people as fellow humans and some as property? The one hypothesis that is at least consistent with what little we know is that if you were if you're a person of African descent from the Caribbean or the Americas, in other words, you know, you maybe were second generation or third generation, you spoke the language, knew the technologies, you were a fellow sailor, you were a fellow human. If you were somebody in the hold who speaks some African language that these people don't know, I think you were othered and treated as property. In other words, I think there might have been a cultural, you know, division between those two things. But again, it's only guesswork because everything in this time period, you know, the evidence is not nearly as thick as we would like. It's threadbare in spots. You're left with intriguing questions and no data, and you have to kind of guess based on triangulating what you do have. But it's an intriguing, important thing, and it's certainly the pirates were highly destabilizing to the slave states around them and a place of freedom and liberation for many individual slaves and former slaves who came and joined them and became, you know, treated as equals and sometimes as leaders among the pirates.
That was such an interesting distinction that was made both in your book and in the Netflix series, that there's a dichotomy, you know, a split between how the pirates viewed the slaves that were still chained up in the ships that they plundered and their fellow pirates who were fighting and, you know, taking a share of the plunder and had been former slaves. It's like they didn't really see them as the same people.
Yeah, and I can only guess it's that, you know, the othering. These other
right.
people, yeah,
right.
and that's just, I mean, humans are often like that, right? And this was also still, you know, this is 1716, 1717, 1718, you know, the line in the Americas where race and enslavement are absolutely synonymous. It was happening, but it wasn't fully formed. For instance, in the Bahamas and in North Carolina, that wasn't the case yet. You know, there were still, you could still be an indentured servant who was of African descent, finish your indenture and be as freed and propertied and have the same rights as any white indentured servant and go off in either of those colonies. In fact, there's a character, Thomas Walker, who shows up in the Netflix series and is, you know, I discovered while researching Republic of Pirates, he was basically, when the pirates took over, he was the last official British person left in the colony, and he was horrified, and he tried to fight against the pirates and ordered them to go away, and they, you know, would tell him to go lay down, and he'd order them to go away again. They threatened to burn down his house, and he, you know, he had a hard time of it. And he'd been the Admiralty Court Justice or something like that. But when you dig into his background, his wife is of African descent. All their children are, you know, mixed race at the time, and that was considered entirely normal. Nobody comments on it as being strange. In fact, one of his grandchildren marries into George Washington's family, his brother, if I remember right. And, you know, so it was still a murkier time, and the pirates were definitely on the side of, you know, let's keep it murky and this doesn't matter as much. Whereas once you got to Barbados, you know, that would be a different story. And South Carolina very rapidly.
Right. In the course of your research, did you make note of any notable Black pirates whom we would know by name?
Well, the main people of African descent who are pirates, we only know their names in passing, Black Caesar and, Julian, and you don't have a lot of details, unfortunately, and none of them do we have the rich kind of biography you would like to have to be able to really tell their stories. Most of what we know, even about the principal pirates like Blackbeard and Black Sam Bellamy and Stede Bonnet, is not even in their words, it's in the accounts of their victims. Their victims would write these depositions when they finally got away, because the pirates usually let their prisoners go and they would get back to authorities and tell them everything that had happened, or at trial when they gave evidence, or the Royal Navy captains who were tracking them down in their letters and intelligence that were sending back to London, or the governors who were also trying to capture them and their intel that they were providing and the depositions and their spies and everything. So basically all the pirates' victims and enemies, that's how we know anything about the pirates. They left no records of their own and no writings. And even more so if you're starting to work down to any kind of ordinary sailor, or unfortunately all the ones of African descent, we don't know much of anything firsthand. So we know from all the witnesses, that they were, the proportion of the crew that were Black and white, and that the Black sailors were operating as total equals, or that this person was a captain and was of African descent, and so on. But we don't know their biographies and what their story is. Were they fugitive slaves or escaped this particular person, or had they been free, legally speaking, and joined the pirates, or had they been merchant sailors before that? Probably all those things, but unfortunately, again, the records are more threadbare than one would like to really be able to tell all these stories. Ditto for the women pirates, right?
That was my next question.
Right, Anne Bonny and Mary Read, right? Totally intriguing that they existed. There's a lot of fantasy and nonsense attached and accreted to their stories, but the actual facts based on documents is, yeah, they existed. They joined Calico Jack Rackham in stealing a sloop and going off on a crazy raid of piracy that lasted several months, terrorizing all the shipping lanes around Jamaica until they were captured. They wore men's clothing, fought and cussed and did everything that the men did according to the victims, and were raging pirates and were upset with Calico Jack for being a coward in their final battle, and were both found to be pregnant at trial and therefore weren't executed. Their sentence was held back because of that. So we know all those things, but how unusual was it? Was it super strange for them to be there to be female sailors? Because we assume it was, right? All that legend and lore that women shouldn't be allowed on ships because they'll, curse the vessel and go down, or what have you. All these, admonitions from that time period. But again, the intriguing clues out there in the actual official trial documents of Calico Jack Rackham, and therefore of Mary Read and Anne Bonny. The first witness that they call at the court in Jamaica while they're trying them in the Admiralty Court is the master of the first vessel that they sacked, who's a woman. And nobody makes any big deal out of it, right? She's testifying as to what these women pirates were doing and how they raided my vessel. And you're like, but wait a minute, right? Isn't this supposed to be strange? Apparently not, because again, it wasn't commented on as being unusual, which is suggestive that there may have been all sorts of women sailors out there. And if there were women sailors, it's the merchant sailors who rebel and become the pirates. You would think there might be more of them out there as well. But again, we just don't know enough.
So you have this short-lived democracy set in a tropical paradise where every member has a vote. Anybody could be an equal partner. They had disability benefits. They shared their plunder. That all sounds too good to be true. Was that really what it was like?
On a ship-by-ship basis, yeah, it was kind of a leveling, roughshod, radical democracy, right? When democracy was still a scary idea. Democracy was a scary idea in the 1780s to the founding fathers, right? They were trying to create a republic. They were scared of the masses having rule. So in the 1715, 1720, this is crazy ideas. But they were radically democratic on each ship they took. So they would seize a ship and all those things you said they would do. They would elect their captains by a show of hand, depose them at any time except during combat by a show of hand, share their plunder equally, have disability benefits. You lost a leg, you get off the top an extra share of treasure, and so on and so forth. But when they all came together, so the Nassau in the Bahamas was their base. And you have all of these different pirate crews and vessels come into that base, each of which was like a little democracy. The actual republic, so to speak, was more like, for those of you who saw that television series Deadwood, about, which is the themes of Deadwood. It takes place beyond the reach of law in the Dakota territories, where a rogue settlement, everyone's pursuing gold and minerals, but they're deep within indigenous people's land where they're not supposed to be by federal law. And they start this rogue settlement, and there's, the whorehouse owner and the crazy miners and the sort of sheriff figure, and nobody's in charge, right? There's no government. And yet there's all these different power bases interacting, and somewhere there's order out of the anarchy, if you know what I mean. I think that's what Nassau was like. You had all these separate rival crews, some of whom were captained by enemies. They organized their defense together. They had their shared base that they all needed against their opponents. And each ship was organized democratically. Exactly how it worked as an amalgamated government is probably a lot more informal, but it would have required, democratic discussions between all the different factions in order to function. There was no king and no lord. So it was probably some kind of informal representative republic of a bunch of, states. Each ship was a state that was democratically organized, and then they all kind of fought over control over the big decisions that had to be made in Nassau.
So the base of operation was Nassau. Many of the pirates, a lot of them came from England or France or Spain or Portugal, the countries that created and controlled the transatlantic trade routes. But in your book and in the series, they talk about a number of pirates who actually hailed from further north on the eastern seaboard. We have Sam Bellamy from Cape Cod, who plundered the trading vessel, the Witta. And just last month, I read a story about the discovery of some Arabian silver coins that were found in an apple orchard in Rhode Island. That was believed to be plunder from a Muslim ship, and which suggests that at least one pirate found a hiding place in New England. So tell us about New England's pirate history.
Yeah, so these pirates, the Bahamas-based pirate gang, were operating all over the place. When hurricane season would come in the Caribbean, they would, move northward and attack shipping up here. Kind of like the cruise ships come up here, when hurricane season comes, they base out of Portland and go to New Brunswick. Pirates did the same thing. They don't want to get caught in a hurricane. They came up here and raided our shipping and the shipping in what's now Atlantic Canada and all the way up to the St. Lawrence River. Exactly the same pattern. And some of them, as you mentioned, like Sam Bellamy and Palsgrave Williams, were from New England originally, but all had joined this pirate gang, and then almost all of them came up to New England to do raiding. But another thing that you might do if you were a pirate and coming to New England is, if you had an enormous parcel of treasure you needed to get rid of, it was well known that a particular family, the Gardeners of Gardeners Island, which is off the seaward end of Long Island, New York. You can find it on the map. It's a pretty chunky island. It is still owned to this day by the Lords Proprietor of Gardeners Island, who were granted the proprietary, fief to this island way back in the, late 1600s. And the 14th, Lord Proprietor is still there. There's New York Times features about them and stuff. Well, anyway, the 9th or 8th Lord Proprietor, living on this island near the main shipping channels, was famous for fencing the goods, acting as sort of a Swiss bank for anybody who wanted to come, right? Oh, you've come and stolen a bunch of stuff from, the leader of India or from the king. No problem, come on over. You just drop into Gardeners Island, we'll keep it for you. And then you can come back and pick it up if you need to. That's what Captain Kidd did. William Kidd visited the Gardeners. And then, one generation later, a number of these pirates, for some reason, when we know them to have huge amounts of treasure, seem to end up sailing right around Gardeners Island and disappear for a couple of days. And Henry Avery, who had raided ships in the Red Sea and had accumulated a massive amount of treasure, and there was a worldwide manhunt for him. He was kind of the prototype for all these pirates. He was active in the 1890s. And he rebelled, basically declared himself to be sort of like a Robin Hood's Men figure, and sailed off into the Indian Ocean and raided all these vessels. And then when everybody on Earth was trying to capture him at all costs, he showed up in the last place anyone expected him to, in Nassau in the Bahamas in 1890 and then 1696, well ahead of these pirates, right? To fence the goods. He arrived in this stolen massive Asian treasure ship belonged to the Grand Mogul of India, and he basically fenced it, sold it to the governor of the Bahamas Islands. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Give me a sloop. You can keep. You can give me, a 1-to-2 exchange rate, and off I go. And he and his other men took off in these various vessels with their treasure. And we know from the accounts that one of these groups went to Long Island Sound, Gardiner's Island, and Rhode Island for a time. Then when I heard that those coins were found, it makes perfect sense. Via Gardiner's Island and associated networks in Rhode Island, were able to fence those goods. So yeah, New England played a central role. Sam Bellamy was probably doing the same thing prior to the Whydah being destroyed and so on. It was a well-known place, Gardiner's Island and Rhode Island, to get rid of your ill-gotten gains.
So what was Maine's role in the pirate world? You mentioned Maine a couple of times in the book, and it's not really a place you're going to associate with piracy. So what was going on up here?
So the pirates desperately needed, think about it, you're a pirate, you're far from Nassau, you've been raiding ships, you leave Nassau, you'd sail to the approaches to a major harbor, and you'd grab every ship you could and then take off before the authorities, figured out the ships weren't coming into port and go after you. So they would go to the mouth of the, Capes of Virginia, at the mouth of the Chesapeake, and do that. Or they'd go to the Charleston Bar, where all the vessels going out of Charleston, they can't see, it's miles away that the vessels are being captured, but you can sit there and capture the vessels and move on. The approaches in Massachusetts Bay to Boston Harbor and so on. So that's what you do, but then what? You've got all this treasure, and the police are everywhere trying to get you. You need somewhere where you can hide out with your treasure, do some rest and recuperation, repair your vessel, chill out for a bit because you're far from Nassau and you can't go there. These different little pirate rendezvous bases. And so what are the criteria for that? Relatively near major shipping, in somewhere that has no European presence and has lots of hideaways where you can stow a ship and no one will see it or find it, and no authorities around to bug you, right? And so a couple of places that were like that, there are all kinds of islands in the Caribbean they would go to for that, but also in Cape Fear in North Carolina and other parts of the impoverished North Carolina colony, you could do that. And if you were in New England waters, Maine was perfect, especially eastern parts of Maine, because Maine in this time period was in the middle of a century of Anglo-Wabanaki wars that had been triggered by Massachusetts, starting in the King Philip's War in the 1670s. And this series of wars, which traumatized Maine and has shaped our people, and I talk about in the Press Herald series Colony and in the Lobster Coast, ran all the way through to the 1760s. Maine was a killing fields, a total, disastrous place for settlers and Wabanaki alike, but especially for the settlers, because in Maine, the English were losing these battles because the settlement in Maine was so sparse that the Wabanaki actually outnumbered them, were able to push them off each time a war would break out. So Eastern Maine was then claimed by France, right? Everything on the other side of the Penobscot was technically New France, and the other half was New England. So it was this contested territory with a strong Wabanaki presence and almost no French authorities there, bordering on a struggling English colony that could barely hold its own, better yet chase off pirates, with all of these gazillion archipelago of islands and deep estuaries going way up into the interior, and bays and hideouts where no one will ever find you. And so the pirates were regularly stopping into places in Maine, usually leaving no trace, no record for us to know about. But in enough instances, they left a trace, they left a radar ping in the records. So Sam Bellamy was headed when his ship was destroyed in a terrible storm on Cape Cod, losing most of his men. He was headed for Damerscove or Monhegan, and surviving parts of his flotilla that had gotten separated during the storm and didn't know that the Whydah had gone down. Half of them arrived in Damerscove and off Booth Bay, and half of them arrived at Monhegan Island, all waiting for the rest of them to show up. And then another major pirate, Labuse, who operated with Bellamy quite a bit, at the same time period sailed off to Machias and worked his way up and set up what might have been a pirate base in Machiasport en route to the St. Lawrence. So, there were all kinds of pirate encounters for short-term periods where they needed somewhere to hang out and lie low while things cooled down, and then work their way back to Nassau or continued on their raiding missions.
So you're saying Maine has always been a vacation land for somebody.
Indeed.
So tell us about Edward Teach. We know him better as Blackbeard, Your book was the basis for the NBC series Crossbones, which starred John Malkovich as Blackbeard, and Taika Waititi is making a comedy series about Blackbeard. Why is he so notorious? And did he really do everything that he was accused of? And did he ever come to Maine?
Yeah, we don't know for sure that he came to Maine, although he might well have. He raided vessels in the Boston area, and it's possible. But he was famous because, to my thinking, he seems like he's the most strategic and calculating of the pirates. So he figured out by the time he had a large frigate-sized vessel and could terrorize the seas. By the time that happened in the early part of 1718, he'd figured out that the best thing to do was to create a brand of terror, so that everyone would be so scared of you they would surrender without firing a single cannonball, without a fight. That way, you didn't damage your ship. You didn't damage the ship or the cargo you were trying to capture, and most importantly, you didn't hurt any of the crewmen on the ship you were trying to take over, because guess where all the pirates' recruits came from? Volunteers from merchant ships they captured. The pirates would capture a ship, and the merchants, who had been mistreating crews so badly, starving them, not paying them, beating them up and stuff, that as soon as they saw the pirates arrive, a proportion of them, a third, a quarter typically, would volunteer to join the pirates and leave with them. That's how the pirates kept growing their numbers. So you don't want to hurt any of your recruits either. So you want everybody, as soon as they see you, to just surrender without firing a shot. And he was great at that. He grew this big, long black beard, and then he attached fuses in his beard and lit them so that smoke and sparks were coming out, and had these, bandoliers of grenades and cutlasses. And
so he really did that?
He did all those things. And his crew would do the same thing. They would so basically they were, they'd raid the fineries of wealthy passengers in a society that was very stratified, right? Peasants never wear rich people's clothes, because only rich people can wear those things. But you have all of these, it's like, the Mad Max movies, Under the Thunderdome or something, right? There, you got the raiders there with their cutlasses and their arm. They're wearing, women's, gentlemen's wigs and women's dresses and, colorful scarves. And it was just like, the world was coming to an end from the perspective of the captain of the vessel they were attacking, which was entirely the point. So almost never did anybody fight them at all. And it meant that Blackbeard never killed or harmed anybody prior to his final battle with the Royal Navy. And this is as I said before, the accounts of his victims, right? They're all totally terrified of the guy, but he threatens them. He threatens to do all kinds of terrible things to them. If you watch closely, he never actually hurts anybody. And this is at a time when, children in London, would be, beaten to death for stealing a loaf of bread kind of stuff. It was a brutal time. And Blackbeard is surprisingly circumspect in his use of force. And so you can also see the way he plays out his end game when the Pirate Republic is coming to an end. He figures out a whole plan to install himself as a Tony Soprano-like figure in the failing colony of North Carolina with the protection of the governor. Oh, I'm just running a legitimate trash collection business. Here's a bunch of finery that just washed ashore from a vessel, that I will sell to you, the governor of the colony. So he had this whole scheme worked out very carefully where he could continue doing piracy under the guise of being a legitimate citizen of a struggling colony and the protection of the governor. All of that is very careful, strategic thinking, which I think helped, his brand building worked, and that we still hear about him because newspaper accounts in that time period, where people were so shocked by his appearance that he quickly made a splash, and he made a big splash in that General History of the Pirates book. But he was also, I think, his cleverness strategically makes him a more compelling figure than some of the other ones who were, seemed a little bit more like, the Tasmanian, devil, spinning around, going crazy, and then exhausting themselves and disappearing from the stage.
So most depictions of the pirates of the Caribbean take some creative license and get a bunch of details wrong because, the fiction always sounds just better than actual fact. And I suspect that some of the stories that the Netflix series tells about Blackbeard fall into that category. What do you think of the job they did? Aside from misspelling your name, which I will point out.
I did.
I read on your behalf.
Yeah, they misspelled it in 4 of the 6 episodes. They managed to misspell. They got it right once or twice, which is in a way even more embarrassing for them. But yes, Aside from adding the notorious second W, in general, they did, I mean, it's a docudrama. For those who haven't seen it, you have talking heads like myself and other pirate experts interwoven with recreations, but their recreations are relatively high budget for this kind of thing. I mean, they have real actors and real scripts and, you know, sound stages and stuff. It's done at a higher level than I was expecting, you know, a more expensively done docudrama than I was expecting. And there's a lot of dramatic scenes. In general, when you do that, you know, those of us who are the talking heads should be giving all the facts out. And then without contradicting what is known, you can fill in the color with the recreated scenes, right? But the recreated scenes shouldn't contradict what we know to be true or untrue. So using that metric, it's surprisingly good. I mean, the depth they go into in this 6-hour, 6-part documentary, which is kind of, it's basically following the Republic of Pirates plot. You know, there's characters that I dug up in the records and recreated that become characters, you know, live in the recreations, which I found pretty, you know, fun. You know, say, hey, it's Thomas Walker. He's, you know, he's having his moment under the sun after all this time. So in general, it was quite good and much more attention to detail than is usually done. But there are a number of instances where they just, both other talking heads and then therefore the actors just run with total nonsense, which isn't supported by anything, especially unfortunately with the women characters, both Anne Bonny, somehow Mary Read is just removed, doesn't exist at all, but Anne Bonny's story is greatly embellished and all kinds of invented things about her motivations that we, you know, just made up. And then Sam Bellamy's, the legend of Sam Bellamy on Cape Cod involves him being motivated by wanting to earn enough money to be able to marry the 17-year-old Maria Hallett of Wellfleet, Massachusetts, who he's met and has fallen in love with, but her respectable father won't let her marry a penniless sailor. So Sam Bellamy goes off.
Tragic story.
Exactly, in order to win her heart. And he was going back to Cape Cod in order to, you know, find her and marry her. So goes the legend that, you know, we didn't hear until the 1930s, but there's the legend, right? And they just run with the whole thing as if it's absolutely has to be true and add all kinds of details. But maybe a little more worryingly, you know, they embellish things like that Blackbeard betrays his black crew members at the end and like sells them into slavery is just asserted all of a sudden. And I went back through I went to the source and went back into his footnotes and found the primary documents that are the evidence for this. And it was, yeah, extremely weak notion, right? That a former sailor of Blackbeard's who had broken ways with Blackbeard tried to sell 2 people of African descent to a colonial official. And separately, that Blackbeard's quartermaster in Virginia gets apprehended with 2 people described as slaves who he admitted he didn't own those slaves and therefore he was in trouble for stealing them, according to the Virginians. Neither one is suggesting what is proposed. So anyway, those are the details that we historians worry about, but the rest of everyone probably doesn't mind at all.
Because it makes for a better time.
Yeah, I guess so. You could do pretty good stuff though without making anything up. The story holds together really well. So yeah, the factual side of the real truth of the pirates and their story is finally winning the day after centuries of not. So, you know, I hate it when there's even the slightest bit of backsliding because the real story is so much more fun than the fantasy versions.
So I'm going to kick off the audience questions now with a fun one that was submitted in advance. Did the pirates really have peg legs, hooks, and parrots?
Yes, very likely because merchant sailors and Royal Navy sailors had all of those things. So being a sailor in this time period was an incredibly dangerous occupation, right? The chances to die or maim yourself are everywhere, right? You're climbing up these masts to furl the rigging in the middle of a storm and fall from the deck. You have shifting cargo all in barrels, breaking free and rolling over people and removing their hands. You know, people losing their eyes, cannonballs, splintering wood. You know, your chances to need a peg leg or a hook for a hand or have a patch over your eye are legion, and tons of them would have, because the profession was so incredibly dangerous. And then sailors from Northern Europe sailing to the Caribbean for the first time were just amazed by all kinds of things about the Caribbean, including these incredibly colorful birds that you could train, you could even train to speak. I mean, what is more wild than life? There's like, finding some supernatural creature. And so many of them would, train, it's incredibly boring in your time off on ships, just give you something to do, right? You can train a parrot and the parrot hangs out with you and you can teach it to talk and swear and do all kinds of stuff. And then they would return eventually to London or Le Havre or wherever they were going, and they would have the parrots with them on their shoulders. And that became, for sailors generally, a way that you identified sailors, how exotic they are. You have these strange people of the sea who'd come ashore with these colorful creatures. So yeah, but the pirates had them, but the pirates had them because they were sailors, and sailors had them. So all of that is indeed true.
I have a question here from Jason Putnam. Are you aware of any Maine Native Americans becoming pirates or engaging with pirates in any way?
I wish that would be great, but no. I mean, there's some accounts post-dating the pirate outbreak in which Wabanaki are engaging. Like I found the National Archives of Great Britain are now all consolidated in one place, the National Archives building in Kew Gardens outside London. It's the most incredible place you can imagine for a history buff. Like all of the vellum and paper and things made on pig hides from the Magna Carta all the way through to, nearly to the present of Great Britain, all of its colonies and anyone they ever conquered, all of our history, Maine's history. If you want the source documents for early Maine history, they're not in Maine, they're not at the Library of Congress, they're not in Boston, the originals are in Kew Gardens in the, Colonial Office records for our colony, right? Or for the land grants given to Sir Ferdinando Gorges. Same for, all of the other 13 colonies and Atlantic Canada and Quebec and the Caribbean colonies controlled by the British at one time or another, and all sorts of other parts of the world. So it's this massive, massive trove of stuff, like Gandalf going in Lord of the Rings to go study what this ring is and, finding it in the dusty library. So, it's an incredibly intriguing place to go. And I was getting to, I'm sorry, your question was, I was going somewhere with this.
Native Americans.
Right, so in those
pirates.
records, one of the things I found there was, because I was looking for Maine documents when I had some spare time, with these letters from Royal Navy captains based in Boston, because I wanted to see what intelligence they might have about what was going on there, since they kind of were your spies on the ground for the empire. And there's this whole long account in 1724 of the station vessel for the Royal Navy in Boston coming up to Maine in order to negotiate a post-war settlement with various Wabanaki chiefs, and describes their meeting and diplomacy, and it goes on for pages and pages. And it's just, I would love to have an occasion to tell some of those stories in some detail, and I suspect there's a lot more there of just the diplomatic interactions and the struggle for the control of the coast and its resources, and the rapprochement and the relationship between, the European colonizers and the people on the ground here. Because, the early Indian wars, as we called them, in southern and central New England, extirpated and pushed a lot of those tribes right out of the way in central Massachusetts and Connecticut and Rhode Island. But here in Maine, never, right? I mean, the Passamaquoddy and Penobscot are still, of course, still here. The continuity of that through time, there's all kinds of fascinating accounts out there. But unfortunately, I haven't found anything that links the pirates directly with them, but it would be interesting if you could.
Can you talk about, this is a question from Catherine Hartnett, can you talk about your research sources on pirate culture and history?
Yeah, so trying to find anything one can find, because to separate fact from fiction and retell these pirate stories meant by necessity going back to the primary sources for everything, because there's so much hearsay and fantasy just thrown into the story. You needed to source everything and rebuild the story from the ground up. And so anything you could find that would allow you to do that. I mean, if you start with the decent histories that were done before, and you'd work your way back in their footnotes and endnotes to figure out what their sources were, and you'd start there. And so most of those that, to the extent they were relying on real documents, it would be the official government accounts, the colonial office records in England, which would be like, the governor of Jamaica's and the governor's council of Jamaica's official record books and depositions and letters and things they sent back to England in great big files. The governor in the Bahamas, the governing council after the Bahamas is restored, the governor in Virginia. So those are the basic resources most people used in the early 20th century and mid 20th century to write these things. But there's a whole nother set of documents you quickly started realizing must be there in the Admiralty records, the records of the Royal Navy. So they're harder to find because the Royal Navy doesn't organize them chronologically. They're organized by the name of the captain. And you then have to figure out, what was the station ship in the time period you want? Where was it located? What's the name of the ship? Who was the captain of the ship? Then go back and find his letters for that time period when he was assigned and running that vessel. And then you can do the same with the logbooks. You can start tracking. You could track on a map with the logbooks where each Royal Navy vessel was at any particular moment. And you could know that the captain and maybe the first mate's letters may have survived and may be at Q with their updates as their narration as to what they're seeing along the way. And so if you start triangulating those things and then plotting where you think the pirates are, you might guess, oh my gosh, if there's a station ship at this island in this time period, they might have heard rumor of or encountered the pirate to tell you where they are now. And so a lot of it was big Excel spreadsheets, keeping track of the pirates, their locations, the source that places them at those locations. Sometimes they would describe things and not give you a day or a time period, but it had to occur because they were operating a ship that looked like this. It had to be before this moment and after that moment, or vice versa. So you have all these ambiguities. You're trying to sort it out. So triangulating all these things: Admiralty records, Colonial Office records, logbooks, then the customs books of if they're sitting outside the Capes of Virginia or outside the Charleston bar, raiding every ship. It occurred to me, well, the Charleston customs officer would be recording every vessel leaving and its captain and its cargo. And so I went and eventually dug them up. And yep, every vessel that Blackbeard was capturing on these particular days was being dutifully recorded and where it was going. And some of them turned out to be pirate colleagues of theirs who were passing by. And you also had lists of all the contents of the cargo, so you knew what Blackbeard was capturing, right? So you get to start doing that kind of stuff. Then other people become interesting. Somebody who's just, I saw this name before. Well, nowadays, unlike in the early 20th century, we had the ability, even in 2007, you were starting to get the ability to keyword search some databases of newspapers and things from this time period, and could actually do needle in the haystack searches for particular people and see what popped up. And so it was able to do a lot of that kind of stuff. So the newspaper records, to the extent they existed, all of these various government records, and then trying to find things, in the Spanish and French zones to the extent you could, although the archives in both those places, beyond the language difficulties, have not in the past been accessible to researchers. They were sort of guarded away. And so trying to find out what's there, how to get to it and stuff is a little bit trickier. There may still be, some gold, research gold in those records that we've only just begun to probe and touch upon.
I think we have time for one last question. So I'm going to ask this one from Chris Linder. From my son, who is fixated on pirates, there are the most famous pirates, but who's your favorite?
It's a boring answer, but Blackbeard, I think, is my favorite of the group. Yeah, for all the reasons we discussed before. He's psychologically the most interesting in his approach. And so I find him the most fascinating of the group.
Yeah, I think when I was reading the book and also when I was watching the Netflix series, I kind of thought, he's the one, he's just the most colorful, if I may use the word, sexiest.
Right. And he may have been
and successful, everybody roots for the guy who makes it.
And we know that we also know that he was literate, and that there's references to a journal he was keeping that even in the Royal Navy records, but the journal was lost after his capture, so we don't have access to it. But he also was clearly, not very many people could read and write then, so he may have had a background where he kept records of things, had read stuff that allowed him, would have enabled him to, connect at a higher level and, scheme and gather intelligence and, seize things from other captains and stuff that may have given him an edge. But again, we can only guess, right?
Let me add one quick question just for my own benefit. If one wanted to, say, visit, if you were in New England, like a pirate museum or, someplace that was significant in pirate history, where would you recommend we go?
That's a good question. If you end up in the Bahamas in Nassau, there's a pretty good and entertaining pirate museum there. The museum one would be sent to where you can see some neat pirate artifacts is in Provincetown, the Witta Museum. The guy who found the Witta is a rather controversial and colorful figure, which you can all Google and read about on your own. But the things that are found there are genuine pirate artifacts from the Witta, which is a really rare thing to see and to be able to take a look at. And the only other decent cache of pirate stuff related to this Golden Age pirate gang is down in North Carolina in Beaufort and Morehead City, where they found Blackbeard's flagship, the Queen Anne's Revenge, and there's some more genuine artifacts there. So they're all small scale, you're just talking a few rooms kind of thing, not a great big, single cache of stuff that would make you feel like you were completely immersed in the pirates and their world. Again, everything's fragmentary with the pirates, little shreds of evidence that you have to piece together to try to figure out the lost picture.
It's a treasure. I think we need to end it there, and I apologize, I really do, to everyone whose question we weren't able to get to, because I'm seeing a whole lot of really good ones, and if we were going longer, I would ask them all. I want to thank everyone for showing up, and especially Colin for joining me tonight. I haven't actually seen you in over a year in person, so to get to chat with you about such a fun topic is a treat.
Now Fauci says we've vaccinated people can all hang out again, so
yay, let's do this again in person. Thank you to everyone in our audience for joining us. Please join us again for our next Maine Voices live event on June 15th with NASA astronaut Chris Cassidy. The registration information will be in the chat box, so please sign up for that. That'll be a good time. Thank you all for your support of the Portland Press Herald and our journalistic mission. I hope you have a very good night. Stay safe.
Thanks, everybody.